Region Europe is the international program of the University of Turin, pursuing a comprehensive knowledge of the European model of regional integration and of the EU as a global actor. The involvement of 45 guest lecturers coming from all across the world's most prestigious universities and institutions allows us to bring fresh and critical perspectives on crucial issues concerning European integration and the role of the EU in world affairs, with a forward-looking approach. We want to introduce you to how the EU actually works from its beating heart, visiting its institutions and interacting with its actors. From its first edition, each year Region Europe has given the opportunity to more than 150 students coming from all over the world to gather and exchange views and experiences.
Thank you for welcoming me to come and speak to your program. I'd like to talk for my lecture about some very, very broad questions and broad issues regarding the European Union and what it's doing in world politics, and in particular through the ideas and concepts of normative power and for planetary politics. And I want to do this in four stages, basically by looking at questions of what I mean by planetary politics, what do we mean by the EU, what does it mean to think about more broadly the EU in planetary politics, and where are we going in planetary politics? This is absolutely critical today. Here we are online, not able to talk to each other in person. The pandemic has spread around the world, and I want to understand how we got here and how we get away from here and what that has to do with EU foreign policy and the EU itself. So the five sections of my talk. One is I'm going to make a simple observation. The EU cannot be understood outside of its planetary context. It's as simple as that. And I'll explain what I mean by that. There's a temptation to study the EU as if it's not on the planet Earth, as if everything it does comes from its internal debates and dialogues, and that's a terrible mistake. Two is I'm going to reflect a little bit on the past and the future of the EU, and I'm going to define what I mean by planetary politics and why this is an important paradigmatic step in changing the way we think about the EU and world politics. Three, I want to talk about the interdependence of economic issues, societal issues, issues of the ecology of conflict and politics, and understand how these interdependencies reflect a realization about the symbiotic nature of the way in which we interact with the rest of the world. And when I say we, I mean humans, and when I say the rest of the world, I mean other humans, other species, other ecosystems. Four, I want to specifically focus on the EU and its foreign policy, and talk about and set up an understanding of normative power, juxtaposed, that means in differentiation to existing understandings of how power politics takes place. This is extremely important and widely misunderstood. And this is the first time I'll do this in this way. And then fifthly, I want to conclude and by then I suspect you'll be very skeptical and hopefully a little bit depressed, conclude about how we can move forwards out of crisis and not repeat some of the problems and challenges that we face in this world by introducing the idea of planetary good, in particular notions of homeostasis and equality, two key features that I think should inform our thinkings about the EU and world politics from here on in. Okay. Firstly, the EU cannot be understood outside of its planetary context. There is a terrible temptation to study the EU as if it is the only or the most important continent on the planet. That has never been true, and it will never be true. We have to understand the entirety of the planetary context. And so when I'm going to talk about the past and the future, I want specifically to have that thought in our minds when we do this, okay? This is the only accurate map of the world. I show it to you as a way of trying to come to terms with the extent to which there is a whole world out there. And it's not just a world of people, it's a world of lives, of ecosystems, of other species, of a living, breathing planet on which we are entirely dependent. So let me first talk about that planetary context. Here's 5 examples, and I'm going to come back to these 5 throughout today's talk. Let's start with them in order. 1, economy. A deserted church in Turin, okay? We are in a terrible position today where economic struggles and economic decline faces the entire planet at the same time. It's an almost unique moment. We need to understand that the EU cannot survive without the rest of the world's economy. Okay, they can probably survive without us, but we are economically interdependent, more so than at any other time in human history. 2, society. We are interdependent in societal terms. Here's an iconic picture of refugees fleeing conflict, disaster, ecological crisis in Africa and North Africa, and coming across the Mediterranean to Italy. We cannot escape that context, whether it's legal or illegitimate movement of peoples. It's not just about economic activity, it's about human interrelations. 3, here is a picture taken from the Portuguese capital of Madeira. The city is on fire. We expect to see forest fires in Europe every year for the rest of this century. Many European cities will suffer. We've had forest fires in Sweden north of the Arctic Circle. That's never happened before. We are ecologically interdependent with the rest of the world. 4, here's a scene of Ukrainian soldiers battling with Russian soldiers near the Crimea in the Donbass region. Conflict is a fundamental feature of European relations with the rest of the world, and we cannot escape that. 5, politics. Here's a rally of far-right party leaders in Milan. I'm sure I don't need to name them for you. Salvini, Le Pen, and other famous leaders of far-right parties across Europe. It's not just Europe. As we know from the elections over this week, there are far-right, reactionary and populist party leaders have been elected or appointed over the past 5 years across the world. How do we understand that interrelationship, and how does it relate to Europe? All 5 of these areas, the economy, the society, ecology, conflict, and polity, are critical component of the planetary context for understanding the Europe in the world. And I will come back to all these points. The image you see on the left is a picture you may be familiar with. It's taken from the first edition of a book on the EU as a political system. It's the most widely used, you probably use it in this course, and the most common way of understanding the European Union is as a political system. And the image isn't in the second edition of the book, but I like to use it anyway. Look at how bounded that political system is. In this version of understanding the EU, everything that is important takes place within that box. And if you look in the top left-hand corner, you see global policies as a little tiny subcomponent of what the EU is. This is utterly, utterly wrong. And I want to contrast this with a planetary contextual understanding of the EU. On the right is an image taken from a paper I published 7 years ago, trying to understand the EU in terms of political theory. And the article was called European Communion. And when I say communion, I mean sharing. It is quite clear that to understand the EU in world politics, the Europe in the world, we need to understand both the communitarian drive, the drive towards self-interest, the drive towards local communities, the drive towards a European common policy, but also the cosmopolitan concern for others, whether near or far abroad, are a critical component. I would introduce a third component, and I won't talk about this too much in today's talk, but I'm happy to take it in questions. That we should and could combine a communitarian understanding of local politics with a cosmopolitan understanding of global ethics. That doesn't mean to say that everyone in the world is an individual, but it does mean to say that there are translocal politics that cut across this divide. And the 5 images I've just shown you are all examples of local politics across the planet. And we need to think about these. We take these 3 different understandings, communitarian cosmopolitan and local cosmopolitics. It gives us an idea of the way in which we can think about the way in which we share the world. I can come back to these as I go through today's talk. The second component I want to talk about in today's talk is to situate the understanding of the EU and its normative politics, its normative power in planetary politics, both historically and in terms of the future. It is very rare to do this in a discussion of Europe and the world, but it's absolutely essential, because without the past and the future that we know, we are simply guessing. This is an image then, a satellite, composite satellite image of planet Earth. Every light you see is an urban space that is lit up. There are very few boundaries between Europe and the rest of the world on these terms. It is also a map of the hotspots of COVID. COVID, of course, is primarily an urban infection and an urban pandemic that has been spread because we as humans travel a lot, we share a lot, and we interact a lot. Let me define planetary politics then for you as a starting point. Planetary politics are characterized by truly planetary relations of causality that can only be understood and addressed holistically. The emphasis then, and this is from Karen Litvin's piece on planetary politics in 2003, the emphasis then has to be on a holistic approach. And when I say holistic, I mean a sum of all the individual parts, and the whole for planet Earth and for the Earth that we live on is always greater than the sum of the parts. Karen sets out in this famous piece 5 different distinct dynamics, and I will just talk to these and then come back to these as I talk. One is that there's no escape from North-South cooperation when we talk about the South, the red part of the world, the North, the grey part of the world. We are absolutely interdependent. The spread of COVID from China, the red part of the world, to Europe, the grey part of the world, is inevitable, whether it's this form of coronavirus or the next form of coronavirus. So we have to work together on this, but we have to understand the historical dimensions of these difficult relations. 2, there are complex linkages between the local and the global. They are essential to understand. We cannot simply address climate change, the global economy, migration and refugees, COVID, through global-only approaches. We have to combine the local with the global. 3, and I will talk about this in 2 slides' time, we have to think intergenerationally. The audience, and I see some of your happy faces here, are in the primarily, I would assume, their 20s. That means many of the things I'm about to talk about that will happen this century will happen to them. This is the generation of planetary politics, what I call Generation Planet. The intergenerational horizon is an understanding that things that we do or don't do today will affect them and their children and their grandchildren. So this is really about the politics of the present. 4, planetary politics must include a precautionary approach. Currently, the EU is the only international organization that recognizes in international politics the precautionary approach, the necessity to take due account of scientific uncertainty in taking decisions about the economy, about society, about public health, about the environment. And 5thly, just reiterating Karen's point, we need to have a strong tendency towards a holistic understanding of the Earth's systems. That means that we can't simply talk about markets that don't take account of Earth's systems. We can't simply talk about refugees and not understand why they have fled their homes. We can't talk about the environment without understanding human consumption and pollution and extinction and climate change at the same moment. And we cannot talk about conflict without understanding where it's coming from, particularly in those areas that are most at pressure from these planetary politics. Let me move on to a quick reflection on the past. Europe has evolved the way it is because it has been at the core of a world trading system. This has relegated the rest of the planet to being at the periphery. And let's be honest about this, this is both unfair and people don't like this. We don't need to be reminded that, let's take, for example, for the UK undergoing Brexit, it was at the core of many of the events we see historically. And Ireland, one of the countries it occupied, was the periphery. And many people in Ireland paid for their lives with that. Joe Biden's not about to forget that. So that's an interesting surprise today. The second period of history is the first wave of globalization from a European perspective over the 19th and 20th centuries. Colonialism, industrialization, and imperialism. We tend to forget these when we study the EU and global politics. But around the world, most of the world do not forget and will never forget this historical context to understanding the EU. We tend to talk about the EU in global politics by situating it as a natural outcome of the 30-year crisis, the First World War, the Second World War, and the interwar economic depression that gave rise to fascism, the Holocaust, and genocide. That's a good starting point, particularly from a European perspective, and it helps us to understand, to a certain extent, some of the events in Central and Eastern Europe and the rise of fascist and far-right political leaders across Europe and the rest of the world today. But it's just one component of this. The second wave of globalization from the 1970s until the global financial crisis of 2007 is important for understanding the Cold War, the recognition of 31 years since the end of the Berlin Wall today and yesterday is an important recognition, and the arrival of a unipolar moment where the US was the primary hegemon on planet Earth, at least until the events of September the 11th, 2001, and the subsequent decline of the US and as imperial leader of the multipolar order since September the 11th. Today, 10th of November 2020, we look at what I call a planetary organic crisis, and I will define this. The idea of organic crisis, of course, comes from the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci, but it's an important way of understanding the comprehensive nature of the crisis that we face since the global financial crisis from 2007 to date. People talk about this last period as a period of multipolarity, the arrival of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Nigeria, etc. But in fact, that's mini-polarity rather than multipolarity. We are, for good or for bad, living through an era of incredible change, where the knock-on effects of the financial crisis have led us into what some have described as a multi-dimensional crisis. And I've talked about some aspects of this. Refugee crisis, climate crisis, public health crisis, crisis of faith and trust in politicians, and thus the effects that this has on populist causes, simple solutions, never achievable. And here we have the final aspect of this, the corona crisis, the inevitable result of increasing extinction rates and increasing collapse of ecosystems and human dependency on those ecosystems. Let's just turn to the future. And I have 3 slides here where I look at the future. It's incredibly uncommon to talk about the future in international relations and the study of the EU. And that's a terrible mistake. Here are 3 things we know about the future. We already know much of this about the rest of this century. One of them is good news, 2 of them are bad news, and the rest of my talk depends on this understanding. 1, demography. We have a good prediction of what fertility, mortality, migration, and population scenarios look like for the rest of this century. And the good news is that continued trends in female educational attainment and access to sexual and health and reproductive rights, and in particular contraception, will hasten declines in fertility and slow population growth. This is a good news story. We're living longer, healthier lives, and because of that, we're having fewer children. The diagram shows those countries where there's now less people being born than there are passing away. We call this the reproduction rate, which falls below the replacement rate. Look at all the countries that are purple or dark blue or dark green. And that includes the whole of Europe, the whole of Russia, the whole of China, the whole of North America, much of Brazil, the whole of Australia. These are countries where population levels are in decline. Italian population will never be higher than it is today. By the end of this century, during the lifetime of every student watching this presentation, the population of Italy will be half of what it is today. These are incredible effects, and there's almost nothing we can do about them. We can accelerate them by improving female educational attainment and accessibility to contraception and public health. That's the good news story. That means that we expect human population to peak sometime in the 2060s at about 9 billion people. But if we accelerate education and public health, we can actually drive that number down. And that has a tremendous effect on all the other interdependencies. Here's the bad news. Recent climate model projections demonstrate that the assumptions we made during the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2016 were wrong. The climate modeling, in particular cloud and atmospheric modeling, demonstrates that things are getting hotter quicker. And we know that because of the accelerated rate of meltwater from glaciers, the Arctic and the Antarctic around the world. There's an expectation that sometime this decade we will hit 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and then sometime in the next 10 to 20 years after that we will hit 2 degrees. That is disastrous. So we have to do something about that, and we have to do something about that now, not by 2050. The third graph illustrates what this means for the rest of the world. And this is important for studying EU foreign policy. What this means for the rest of the world is that in the coming 50 years, approximately 1 to 3 billion people, depending on how quickly we can stop climate change occurring and reduce to zero carbon emissions, approximately 1 to 3 billion people will live outside the human climate niche. That is, places under 29 degrees Celsius where people can live. At the moment, places that are marked in black on the map are places where you cannot live. It's too hot all year round. By the year 2070, in 50 years, all those areas marked in grey hashes will be unlivable if current rates continue. This will have a dramatic impact on the collapse of other states and societies, their government, their economies, and the pressure on migration. And just look at this map. You're looking at most of Saharan Africa, much of the northern part of the Amazonian rainforest, much of South Asia, and parts of North Australia. We know these three to be true, and so we must act as if they are true. And this is why we need to talk now about what this increasing interdependence and symbiotic relationships mean for the EU and its foreign policy from this point forward. The image I have taken is from an excellent 2016 documentary, which you must see. It's called The Age of Consequences. It's based on a Pentagon report from 2006 that linked together poverty, food shortage, social instability, terrorism, civil unrest, the desertification, drought, economic instability in, interestingly, parts of the world. And what the report in 2006 said is we are seeing these different components being interlinked, and they will lead to mass migration and government instability. The documentary is what occurred when they were linked together, the collapse of governments across the Arab world, which we call the Arab Uprisings. Okay, and specifically the way in which Syria collapsed because of water, drought, and food shortages. These were inevitable. So we need to put together what increasing interdependence means. I'm going to talk again about these 5 components. What we've seen since about the year 1980 is the use of neoliberal austerity as a tool of economics and society. And this is accelerated since the financial crisis of 2007. I don't have to tell people living in Mediterranean countries, particularly Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, what austerity means for one society. We have seen evidence since 1980 of increasing income inequality across the world, but heightened in countries within the EU. By income inequality, I mean approximately 10% of Europeans own approximately 50% of the wealth in their country. If we measure not income but wealth, it is double the level of inequality. Double the level of inequality. That the super wealthy, let's say the 1% of Europe, who generally are not resident in European countries, isn't as true for much of the world, have accelerated since the financial crisis. So we're not all in this together, and we must understand the increasing interdependence of planetary economy, particularly when we're talking about the political consequences of this. And the votes for Trump and the votes for Brexit were fueled by this sense of inequality. For society, this means we face some challenges. If we look, for instance, at OECD reports on social inequality and injustice, we see that since 2007, in Europe and much of the world, intergenerational inequality, that's the difference between what parents earned and what their children earned, has increased. We see that inclusion is decreasing, that we're seeing increasingly parts of our cities, sometimes labeled ghettos, are not benefiting in the same way from the wealthier parts of societies, which are becoming incredibly wealthy. And one of the consequences of this has been health inequalities. Austerity measures taken to drive down the costs of public health since 2007 have meant that those countries that have been forced to reduce government spending the most have been the most vulnerable to the pandemic, particularly Italy and Spain. It's not a coincidence, and we've seen this in the UK as well, and we've seen this in the US. Those countries that have the most vulnerable health systems are those where we've seen the highest levels of infection and inability to deal with this. Ecologically speaking, we've seen that human consumption has driven up high levels of pollution, whether it's air pollution, now one of the biggest killers on the planet, more so than most public health concerns. For instance, malaria or HIV/AIDS. We've seen the arrival of the 6th mass extinction over the past 30 years. There's an estimated 70% of known vertebrate species have gone into decline, if not extinction. And of this, of course, is all related to climate change. The extent to which we argued in the run-in to the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016, we must keep the temperatures below 1.5 degrees increase over pre-industrial era. Well, we're at 1.1 degree today, and we will hit that sometime in the next 9 years. Finally, penultimately conflict, excuse me. The sense of insecurity caused by economic injustice, social inequality, and environmental degradation causes what scholars of insecurity call ontological insecurity, a sense of something's not right in the world, something's not right in our lives, and we don't feel good about that, and we want answers. And we want people that come up with simple solutions and simple answers, such as denying the science, or saying that there won't be a problem, or that we can address this at a national level. Increasing violence in societies is often fueled by this tension. Generally, violence within societies is less than it has been at any other time in human history. But we do see attempts to present violence as being an escalating phenomenon, particularly by those on the right wing of the political spectrum. The one thing we have seen, though, is an increase in militarization. Military expenditure, despite the global financial crisis and economic crisis over the last 10, 15 years, has increased more generally. Whether that's in the BRICS countries, the USA, or interestingly, in emerging economies. India and China now both have active air carrier-driven navies. You put this all together, and what do you get? You get the rise, in particular, of parties and politics who have simple solutions to the problem of the economy, of society. The simple solution is to put the trust in ethno-nationalists. Our nation. Make our country great again. Turn to the past for an answer to the future. Now, this goes hand in hand with the decline in trust of existing political parties and political systems. This is unsurprising. We've seen a decline in trust across the EU, for example, since the second enlargement of the EU in 2006. The global financial crisis and Eurozone crisis, refugee crisis, the legitimacy crisis of the EU, and now the COVID crisis has raised questions and problems. Trust is actually returning in Europe, but in many other parts of the world it's not. The last 14 years, according to Freedom House, has seen a systematic decline in civil liberties and human rights around the world. And this is related to, firstly, the rise of right-wing parties and populist leaders, which lead to an intrusion in human rights, but also, lest we forget, the war on terror led to a decline in civil liberties and rights of privacy. These 5 components go together, and they're interlinked, they're interdependent. I will come back to this in the next slide. What scholars have argued is that we need to put these 5 concerns together. There's a temptation, and you see this so much, to talk about the multiple dimensions of crises, or the multi-crises of the EU. It is one crisis, a planetary organic crisis. Last year, Stephen Gill, a political economist, and Solomon Benatar, a public health official, wrote a little paper on the political economy of planetary health. And what they argued is that the interconnected crises of ethics, economy, social development, health, and ecology can be understood as forming an unprecedented planetary organic crisis, using the language of Gramsci, whose morbid symptoms, that's Gramsci's phrase, pose the proposition that the world has reached a historical crossroad necessitating a significant change of direction. I wish we'd listened to them, because within 12 months they were proved right. They argued that the crisis involved an interacting and deepening structural crisis of economy, society, ecology, politics, and that the notion of sustainable development, as we had been talking about it, was an oxymoron, because we were not using less non-renewable fuels, and we were not using less finite global resources. A subsequent article from this year, reflecting on the public health crisis, pointed out that the planetary organic crisis with inadequately prepared clinical and public healthcare systems is the outcome of inadequate political and economic attention to the enormity of trends. What we need is a paradigmatic shift in global thinking and action to radically reduce wasteful consumption of non-renewable resources, which would embrace the idea of learning to do better with less. And we need to transition from the unrealistic goals of sustainable development to much more credible notions of developing sustainability that could also play a role in reshaping the global political economy. I want to talk about this after I show the next slide on what I mean by interdependent. Just to remind you, when I talk about planetary crises or planetary politics, I talk about seeing the planet as a whole, a so-called ecocentric perspective, not seeing human beings as the center point of politics, which is much of the discourse and dialogue of globalization or world politics is framed in this way. When we talk about organic crisis, we don't mean that it's homegrown, that there's something good about it. It means that the organism as a whole, the planet as a whole, is in crisis. And when we talk about crisis, we don't mean the multiple crises of the far right, populism, the economy, finance, cyber politics, refugees, climate change. We mean all of these are interdependent and connected, a comprehensive crisis. And so this diagram brings together these 5 different spheres. And it tells us that we need to be reminded that the relations that we engage in are what we would describe as symbiotic. They are mutually dependent on one another, as we are on other human beings and the other species of the planet on which we live in. So if we want to address questions of equality, of sustainability, of resilience, of security and justice, we have to think about all 5 components at the same time. In a way, the Sustainable Development Goals set up this way of thinking, but they were both ambitious and perhaps slightly disjointed. I won't talk about that in the talk, but I'm happy to take questions on this. Let's move to the 4th part of my talk, and this is where we get to the EU as an international actor. Part 4 is where I want to talk about normative power as empowering actions in concert. We need to talk about what we mean by power and what power looks like when we study the EU as a planetary political actor or not. Historically, there's been temptation in Europe to talk about military power versus civilian power. This comes back from the historical trajectory of studying the EU and the EC as mostly a non-military actor. In the US, American scholars such as Joe Nye talk about hard power versus soft power. There's a temptation to see these as the same. They're not. But there's also a temptation to forget the question of who is power for and what do we mean by power? How does this help address the symbiotic interrelationships of all the issues I've just talked about? Or does it simply just fuel the ego of the multi-powers on this planet? Hard power, according to Joe Nye, then, is the exercise of influence through coercion, relying on tactics like military force, payments, and economic sanctions. It all sounds great. But the person you enact this power on never forgets that. Soft power sounds much better, doesn't it? It's the power of Disney, of Coca-Cola, of Nike, of Twitter, of Facebook. Soft power uses attraction and persuasion to change minds and influence behavior. Oh, it must be good. Its sources include culture, political values, and positive global engagement. And the conversation often looks like this. Is it hard power or soft power? Lest we forget, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton stood on a Democratic platform of combining hard power, military and defense, with soft power, diplomacy, as a form of smart power. Smart power was her talk. The USA must become a smart power for the world. I think this type of thinking is short-term, it's atomistic, and it's never going to address the types of challenges we face, both in Europe and outside of Europe. We have to change the way we think. We have to change the thinking paradigm. To do this, I started to think of another way of thinking about power. The mistake was, though, that I used the word power, and maybe this was a problem. But let me redefine power for you, okay? I used the phrase normative power. 25 years ago, I started thinking about how can you think about power that's different to, let's say, the USA in the 1990s? How can you think about power that's sustainable, that will last beyond the latest military intervention? How can you think about power that's inclusive, that's not just about colonization, the McDonald'sization of your country, but it's about listening and thinking about what power means. So I define it in this way. Normative power then is about empowering actions in concert for the planetary good. And I'll define what I mean by empowering actions in concert and planetary good in a second. These types of actions could include recognition of others, sharing activities, sharing policies, sharing the way we think about the world with others, and reconciling the types of long-standing existing disagreements and differences that Europeans have had with the rest of the world since the first era of globalization, since the period of colonization, of industrial revolution, to change the dynamic of core versus periphery, north versus south. Now, you may think, well, this is idealistic. There's no way we can think like this. I've got some bad news. We have absolutely no choice, and we must do it now. Let's compare the three different understandings of power that I'm talking about, and then apply them to the study of the EU as a global actor, as a planetary political actor. Column 1 to the right, hard power, dark blue. Column 2, soft power, light blue. Column 3, normative power, red. There's a series of questions that one must always ask about power and the inaction of power, whether it's personal power, political power, party power, national power, or international power. Who is the power for? If you're into hard power and soft power, if you're Joe Nye and you advise Democratic presidents in the US, the power is for the self, us, the United States in this case. But normative power, if it's to be normative at all, has to be shared. It's about achieving something together. And achieving that something is about pressing the types of challenges I talked about at the start of today's talk. But what is power? Classic, particularly US definitions of power, tend to talk about power and international power. Robert Dahl, Stephen Lukes, etc., is the power of A to get B to do what A wants. And of course, A is always America and B is always, I don't know, Bolivia or Bosnia or Belgium. Power is the power of the self over the other. It's getting what you want from somebody else. But is that the only definition of power? No, it's not. If you've ever been in a powerful relationship, if you've ever had a powerful experience, if you've ever witnessed human power, people power, you know that power isn't just about getting what you want over other people. Power, in my understanding, and in the normative power understanding, is about the self not over, but with the other. What form of power do we see? Well, hard power is obviously coercive, forcing people to do what they wouldn't do otherwise, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's military intervention, whether it's diplomatic pressure. But soft power sounds much better, doesn't it? To attract and persuade people that what you want is good for them as well. It would be a really good idea, for example, to liberalize your economy and to open it up to international products and companies to come in and privatize and purchase your health system or your pharmaceutical companies. This all turns out to be a bad idea. We call that, in the words of Gramsci, of course, hegemony. Not coercive, but still powerful. The third approach that I understand power to mean comes from one of the 20th century leading political philosophers, Hannah Arendt. Power for her meant to empower. Okay, it's a verb. It means to grant power, to share power, to be powerful together. What sort of descriptions of power do we see then? Hard power is about tactics. Soft power is about persuasion. But for Hannah Arendt and those that follow this approach, power is about actions. It's about doing things. Not just about talking or influencing. It's about acting to empower together. So what examples do we have? For hard power, of course, it's military, it's payments, it's sanctions. For soft power, it's culture, it's government, the power of democracy, or it's about public engagement. For normative power, this is different. It's about recognition, about sharing, about reconciliation. It's about recognizing the interpersonal, social, human components of power. Now, these three understandings of power do different things. And it's not necessarily the case that we have to separate them, but it's certainly the case that unless you place normative power first, you will always be engaging in self-defeating acts of international engagement. Here's the EU's policy agenda, taken from the External Action Service's website. I'm sure if you've studied the EU as a global actor, you'll be familiar with all of this. 12 different policy areas, some of which are intergovernmental, such as security and defence, foreign policy and border controls, some of which are supranational. The Commission plays an important role, as does the EU budget and the European Parliament, such as refugee policies, humanitarian development and enlargement policies, and trade policies. But when we look at these, and when we see EU enactments of policy, we're often thinking, and I often think this, that there's often a tension, a contradiction between, for example, border policies and development policies, refugee policies and environment policies. This is what I call atomistic or reductionist thinking. To achieve planetary politics, we have to think in a more holistic, joined together and symbiotic way. That was the case for understanding the EU and its policy-making procedures from, for example, Maastricht, 1992, until the development in 2009 of the External Action Service in the appointment of a full-time vice deputy commissioner, also the High Representative for Foreign Policy, and their role in creating a European security, now global strategy. So for the last 10 years, we've seen an attempt to take these 12 different policy foci, these 12 different policy areas, and put them together in a common strategy. But there are some problems with that strategy, as I flip here to a fairly famous organogram. I don't know if you've seen it before. It's the organogram or organizational diagram of the External Action Service. If you've worked in or worked on or researched in the External Action Service, you'll understand what this organogram says. And the global strategy from 2016, June the 24th, 2016, by Federica Mogherini, set out how the EU and the External Action Service would engage in more hard geopolitical thinking, become a global actor with a global diplomatic force and a global strategy comparable to other big strategic global actors like the US, like Russia, like China, like India. And this was done by creating a series, and I've numbered them here, 0 to 8, of strategic directorates. 0 is human rights, global and multilateral issues. This, in some respects, is still similar to the old external relations component of the Commission. But 1 through 6 are geographical, geopolitical organizations of EU policy with the rest of the world, from Africa to the Americas to the Asia and Pacific to West Europe to East Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. And the thinking in these terms is, like so many other global actors, done on terms of, right, what's the geographical component? What is the political component? Who do we have on the ground? What do our representative offices, our diplomatic missions look like? Do we have special representatives there? What sort of crisis is taking place? Very much thinking like an international actor or state. Organization directorates 7 and 8 are the crisis and security and military directorates. And it's here that we see, at least in Africa, in Europe and the Middle East, an attempt to, if not project power, then project peace, whether civilian, military, or more often than not, mixed peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace-building missions. But the general picture over the last 10, 11 years has been to try and encourage the diplomatic core of the EU, the External Action Service, to think in geostrategic terms, to think like and engage with other actors as if the EU is a rather large, let's say 450 million, 500 million organization, if not state. As you will see from my next slide, I think that's a mistake in thinking for a number of reasons. Not only does it not necessarily join together the 12 different policy areas in a sustainable way, it actually copies the types of mistakes, international, strategic and diplomatic mistakes, that have led us to where we are on the crisis of this planetary organic, on the cusp of this planetary organic crisis. So, let me return to the slide that I talked about when we talk about how we need to think about not just reacting to the symptoms of international politics, the rise and changing configuration of the international or multilateral, multinational political order, the end of, let's say, the liberal international order and the rise of the illiberal multilateral order, or multinational order. How do we think in a deeper, more sustainable, holistic way? How do we address not just the symptoms, but the causes? Because unless we do this, and we have little time to do this, we are constantly reproducing the mistakes that led us to, let's say in the case of the 2010s, the types of rise of the far right that we saw in the 1920s and 1930s, in the case of the shift from hegemonic political order of the British Empire in the 1900s to the American Empire of the 2000s. We need to think more out of the box in those terms. And here I'm going to share with you a little bit some steps in that thinking, which is to connect together the symbiotic components with some specific tools, in particular the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. If we're to address inequality, we need to reduce inequality both within and among countries. If we're to address sustainability, we must ensure sustainable consumption. And most unsustainable consumption is done by the super rich. About 50% of all global carbon dioxide emissions are directly the result of about 10% of global travelers, of global owners, and of global businesses. We need to make human settlements, whether they're villages, rural villages, or urban cities, inclusive and safe and resilient. We need to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition. Food security and hunger has accelerated during the period of the corona crisis. And certainly in the case of the UK, we're going to discover this on one day, the 1st of January 2021, food insecurity will arrive at the shores of the United Kingdom. And we need to, SDG 16, promote peace, justice, and strong institutions. Now, all of these are aims to be achieved by 2030 by the Sustainable Development Goals. The problem is, it's too late by 2030. We have to change our thinking now. And this is how we might do it when we look at the EU. Starting from the top, in economic terms, the EU has tried to promote at the same time freedom of trade, of business, of services, at the same time as social solidarity with the poorest countries in the world. This is a contradiction. It has quite problematic effects. If we look at society, the EU has tried to promote human rights at the same time as promoting equality. It's been successful in promoting equality to a certain extent. If we look at the rising questions of equality of gender equality, of equality of minorities, it's been successful. But sometimes there's a contradiction in relations with the economy. 3, sustainable development and climate change. As I've mentioned before, sustainable development is not currently possible, and certainly not by 2030 and probably not by 2050. The goals being set out for zero carbon emissions by 2050 will be too late to address climate change in any significant way. We need to think about this far more early, and that's why climate change must be a central feature, not just of EU policy internally, and we've seen this with the Green New Deal, but in its engagement with the rest of the planet. When we talk about peace and security in the EU, we must talk in the same way about peace and security, that is sustainable peace, outside of the EU. In particular, the rule of law. We tend to disassociate these. These are the same conversation. And finally, democracy and good governance are the same issue. Not just the promotion of our type of democracy, but understanding how democracies fail. And look how close we are to some aspects of this in the United States and the United Kingdom. Two of the world's oldest democracies can't organize referenda or elections efficiently and have trouble declaring an authentic outcome. So these are very genuine factors in understanding what the EU should be doing with its normative power in planetary politics. To conclude, I just want to give some hints so that we don't feel too depressed about how we move forwards in understanding the EU, its normative power in planetary politics. How do we realize the planetary good together? This is a cover image from my most recent book, which only just came out, so it's okay if you miss it. It's an edited volume on transnational solidarity. It's really about the way in which we have to encourage, in the 21st century, solidarity that crosses borders, crosses peoples, crosses nations, and crosses civilizations. We are not in an era of the clash of civilizations, as one of the world's leading neo-racists argued. There are a number of different ways of doing this. One is to think about positively, what does it mean to empower the future? I talked about the fact that the EU needs to focus on its normative power. How could it do that if the EU isn't a movement of people, but is a regional integration organization? It needs to think differently, and we need to think differently on what we mean when we engage in and enact power in planetary politics. This image, for instance, is a group of school children, could be in any city in the world, on a Fridays for Future in action. So they are empowering each other and empowering other groups to take action. In my lifetime, in the last 30 years of studying the EU, I've seen at least 9, if not 90, different examples of what normative power could and should look like, of what empowering the future does look like. And I just want to remind us of them before my final slide. Today, as I said before, is the 31st anniversary of, top left-hand image, the Brandenburg Gate, 10th of November 1989, when people changed the relationship between Germany, East and West. In the 2000s, the color revolutions, middle top image, the Orange Revolution of 2004 in Ukraine, which led to the Maidan demonstrations, and top right-hand corner, Tahrir Square in Egypt, which sadly did not lead to, although it led to a change in government, it did not lead to a change in a repressive regime in Egypt. Middle left image, the World Social Forum in 2002. The middle image of the 9, the Occupy movement, this one of New Yorkers occupying Wall Street in November 2011. The right-hand image in Rome, you should recognize it, the Black Lives Matter movement. Bottom left-hand corner, the Me Too movement. Here in Seoul, Korea. Bottom middle image, the Extinction Rebellion movement, here against the coal and carbon industries in Johannesburg, South Africa. And the bottom right-hand image, Fridays for Future movement, not in a developed country, but in Afghanistan. And the armed guard tells you how important that is as these school children take to the streets to demand a future now. What these 9 images say to me and get me thinking about is how can we think positively about change, about transformational change, and about normative power in a way that isn't about the power of A over B, that is about empowering the future together. My last slide. We need to realize the planetary good through 2 concepts, homeostasis and equality. The idea of addressing the planetary organic crisis, of addressing the economic problems, the refugee problems, the ecological problems, the social problems, the conflict to which this inevitably leads, and the impact this has in the swing to the right and the loss of civil liberties and human rights across the planet over the last 15 years, requires thinking differently. It means realizing the planetary good of homeostasis and equality. By homeostasis, I mean the advocacy of the necessity of maintaining stable conditions. That's literally how we define homeostasis, a stability of sameness. And although that's an ecocentric focus, a focus on the planet as a whole, not just humans, there's also an anthropocentric focus, a focus on humans by advocating human equality everywhere through social, economic and political justice in our planetary system. The green, then. How could we enact greater homeostasis? We need to bring greater balance to the way in which we pollute. Of this, there's no doubt. Interestingly, the coronavirus crisis shows us a way in which we can address some of these problems of homeostasis in the planetary system. We have polluted less. We have seen the revival in just 6 months of animals and species as they rush across the streets of our often deserted towns and cities. And we have immediately led to the first decline in the growth of carbon dioxide emissions for the past 50 years. Now, I wouldn't recommend using a pandemic to address climate change, but it does show us that it is possible to reduce the chemical imbalance of pollutants, of the biological imbalance of extinction, and the physical consequences to global heating through our consumption patterns. And certainly, going online as we are today's lecture and not flying to each other's locations might be one solution to this, as painful and annoying as it is. If we look at the red box, though, there's the human element, and this is equally important. Advocating human equality within and between societies has 3 aspects to it. We need much greater social equality, and we need to recognize that this is a problem. We need much greater economic equality, and this involves progressive policies to, in particular, reshore tax evaders' company and income that has offshored over the past 50 years. And we need greater political equality. As I mentioned, the one good news from this story is that gender empowerment and greater women's education and equality is a driving factor around the transformation of the way in which we are using and re-empowering our human beings across the planet. There are 3 final sentences, and then I'll take questions. 1 is we need greater truth towards a more holistic understanding of planetary politics and the EU. Less than 13% of people surveyed in the run-in to the UK referendum on the EU could answer any questions of any significance about the EU. Most voters who voted Republican in the presidential election last week did not believe that climate change and global warming was occurring. So there is a necessity, as I hope I've done in today's lecture, to demonstrate that we must think holistically and we must be informed about why we need to think holistically. 2, we need to take action. We need to teach more, We need to understand more, we need to talk more, and we need to share more of this understanding. But we need more lifestyle sustainable practices in doing this. It's a shame I'm not with you in Turin, but you know what? I wouldn't come anyway, because I'm trying to stop flying. I'm trying to do my bit to have a more sustainable academic lifestyle practice and engage in these types of conversations with people around the world. 3, we need to move beyond the way we think about the EU in global politics, power in global politics, EU policies in global politics, and the way in which the 12 different areas of policy connect together. The coronavirus pandemic is forcing us to deglobalize. Since 2007, we've been deglobalizing international trade as a proportion of global GDP. Since 2019, we've been deglobalizing in terms of production and linked together production lines. We need to regionalize. We need to regionalize where it's best to regionalize. But we need to deregionalize where it makes no sense. And I don't know why we need to have, for instance, tax benefits for air flights within Europe when we don't give similar tax benefits to other forms of more sustainable transport. I am very much looking forward at some stage to catching the train to Turin, and I will wait for that moment. But we also need to localize, not localize because our ethnic or social group is best, but localize because it's more sustainable. Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me talk.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much. And there is much food for thought here, because of course, your planetary politics approach is inspiring, fascinating, but also challenging and demanding, of course, for everybody. That is for scholars and for the people and so on and so forth. So now, of course, the floor is open to students' questions, comments, and so on. But first of all, Jan, I cannot resist, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the principled pragmatism approach, to say, included in the European global strategy? Yes, so I cannot resist. I'm sorry, but this is my first question, and then.
Super. When I was at the EUI in the 1990s, I worked with an excellent Italian scholar called Sonia Lucarelli, and we wrote a book together on values and principles in EU foreign policy. It's interesting that, because in the concluding chapter, we talked precisely about principled pragmatism.
It is here, of course. Yeah.
What a great book. Yeah, you must have it to hand. So if you open the concluding chapter, you will see that Sonia and I talk exactly about principled pragmatism. The problem with it, the good thing with it is that it is an essential component of the UN. The UN has principles, it's the UN Charter, and it does the best it can to enact those principles in any way possible. And that is UN principled pragmatism. This is what the two previous former UN General Secretaries have tried to do, or Secretary Generals have tried to do. It's a nice idea, and I don't think it's unfair to say it's an Italian idea to put it in the global strategy. If Natalie Tocci was here now, I'm sure she would agree. But the question is, what are the principles in which you are being pragmatic about? If there was a phrase like the one I'm trying to use here, which is the EU is for, then I think you could be pragmatic about promoting what the EU is for. But it's not clear to me what the principle is that the EU is for. That European citizens is often the answer. European states is often the answer. The European Union is for Europe. The problem with that type of principle, the promotion of the self, is it's short-sighted. It doesn't address many of the consequences that I've talked about in today's lecture. Now, that's not to say that the EU should be for other people, because there will be no support amongst European citizens when you got to the European Parliament election time for an EU that is only about other people. So I want to know, my question is, principal pragmatism is fine if you are clear about what's the principle you're trying to promote and in what way are you doing this pragmatically that will achieve that goal. Because at the moment, even if you say we promote sustainable development, well, there's no way of achieving sustainable development. The last time Europeans consumed sustainably was about 110, 130 years ago. So, what you're doing is being pragmatic about something that's not at all principled. That's my best answer to your question. Thank you, Giovanni.
Okay, so there is a question from Lucia. I don't know whether she can talk or not, but Lucia, can you talk or do you want me to read your question? Lucia? Okay, maybe it is better. Okay, so Professor, in your opinion, what industrialized countries' policy are specifically necessary for the transition from the actual economic system to an ethic and egalitarian system? Because, like you tell, the demography analysis shows that the countries most affected by global warming, in particular African and small Pacific Island countries, are also the more exploited by neoliberal capitalistic economic system. These reforms would be counterproductive for the Western world and its dominance. Do you think it's possible a new global order completely different from this, or the Western clout are stronger of this change?
Yeah. What I'm going to do is, let's see if this works.
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
I just wanted to, I always get this question, and I've got no easy way of answering that question. There is a debate, particularly amongst green groups and left groups, of, well, it's easier to imagine the end of civilization than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And my argument is that, you don't have to imagine either. What you do have to imagine is that all forms of change are possible. Here's 9 pictures, and I show this because this is the story of my life, my academic life. It is unimaginable that any of these changes that many of these led to would take place. It is unimaginable. When I was an undergraduate student in the 1980s, it was unimaginable that the Cold War would come to an end. It was unimaginable that women would have equal rights. It was unimaginable that black lives, and I was a student in the US, that black lives would actually matter. It was unimaginable that other forms of ethnic groups and other forms of identity groups would achieve equal rights. It was unimaginable that there was something called global warming. So what these types of groups and movements and thinking do is they imagine another world is possible. That's not just a slogan. It requires action to make doable and make an eventuality. And the starting point, as I said in this slide, is to understand the holistic consequences. Yeah? The first 3 facts that I talked about in the future are going to happen. I make this point particularly when I'm in Denmark, but I can make it in the Netherlands and I can make it in the UK. All of these countries will, in the lifetime of students watching this presentation, suffer from severe economic and social damage caused by weather changes and rising sea level. Okay? Part of my university at Copenhagen will have to change campus because in the next 50 years it will be wiped out. So you just have to make that a fact. You just have to start by saying, unless we do this, this is what happens. 1.3 billion people will be forced to move on planet Earth in your lifetime. Not hypothetical, it will happen. There's almost no way of changing this now. That changes everything. So I think making actual is the first point is, speaking the truth to power and understanding that this is where we come from. How many times have you heard a professor or a lecturer teaching EU foreign policy talk in the way that I have done today? And why not? Why isn't the first chapter of each book about the interrelationship between the EU and Europeans and the rest of the world, as if both mattered? Now, there are other actions that we can do, but I think stopping the leakage of carbon emissions, of wealth, of taxation, of corporate activity, of political influence in both democracies and non-democracies. And when I say leakage, I mean that the most influential people in the world aren't to be found anywhere. It's not that they're a citizen of everywhere, they're citizens of nowhere. Now, this isn't to bang the populist drum. Many of the populists that seize power are themselves tax evaders. $750 paid by Donald Trump in tax last year. This is the problem. So the starting point is really about identifying where the problem is and speaking the truth. I'm sorry if that doesn't give a full explanation, but it does for me as a professor of politics.
Okay, there is a question from Camilla. Camilla, please take the mic.
Yes, thank you for the very inspiring lecture. I would like to know your opinion on the SDGs strategy, and if this is a global plan that is good to answer the current interdependent crisis, and if it will bring the necessary change that we need in this moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Camilla. I'm going to give a general answer and a more specific answer. The reason I'm doing this is I'm not familiar enough, and I don't think anyone is, on all of the SDGs. I think the SDGs are a great start to a conversation about holistically addressing the problems on this planet. I think it would have been a good place to be in the year 2000. If the SDGs that we are now faced with had been more ambitious in 2000, when we had the Millennium SDGs, or even, let's say, in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit and the desire to create an agenda of action, we might have stood a better chance of addressing some of the problems I've identified in today's talk. I think the problem is that we're always playing catch up. We think that because the SDGs were agreed in 2015 and the Paris Summit agreed a climate action plan, that was good enough. Neither are good enough, but they are a good start, but they're too late. That being said, there are some specific SDGs that are really, really, really important. And I identified these in passing through today's talk, but I'll go back to them again, particularly those that have to do with education, with gender empowerment, with maternal health, and in particular those that are associated with environmental auditing of corporate activity. The first set are important because through education, and to be honest, further and higher education is a luxury that we have in the global north, but it is not one that is widely present in the global south. If it were, and this might be an answer to the previous question, Lucia's question, probably the best thing that we can do is develop indigenous universities with indigenous professors in the global south that are good enough to provide the sorts of education that you're benefiting from today. We have to move immediately to maternal health, sexual and reproductive rights and health, widespread education and educational attainment for mothers and for women. This, out of all the goals clusters in the SDGs, I think is the one that can really bring about change, not just in terms of addressing questions of fertility. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that women historically and women of colour have historically been the most disadvantaged, discriminated groups on the planet. And so they see the world in a different way as opposed to, let's take me, you know, a white middle-aged European male. So I think that's extremely important. But I also think that the other side, the economic side, the introducing corporate goals and regulations regarding environmental use and the auditing of supply chains is extremely important. And I think the EU and most countries around the world should immediately move to making non-sustainable economic practices taxable. That will, of course, force them offshore. And so then taxing trade with those types of entities and taxing owners and corporate activities associated with. And this is why I think a green tax, a European green tax, is absolutely essential. So, yeah, I mean, a combination of nice start, but not good enough. And some of the SDGs are really interesting and really important. Now we need to put them all together in the round. Thank you for your question, Camille.
Okay. Eleonora, there is a question from her. Please take the mic.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you so much for your amazing speech and for your time. My question is about the 9 pictures that you've shown before. They all show people, like population, in the street asking for something, demanding something, and empowering a problem. My question is, will it always have to come from the people, or can we expect in the future something like independent way of thinking from the policies itself, or we will always have the need to go on the street and ask it by ourselves? Will it ever come, like, really as an act independently from policies? Thank you so much.
Great question, Eleonora. Yeah, I call this the Petra Kelly question. You won't, I think, be familiar with Petra Kelly. Nod if you are. Eleonora, have you heard of Petra Kelly? You have. Okay. Excellent. Great. Which is, you know, is the purpose of people power, and in particular green activist groups, to always be on the outside, or should they ever come on the inside? And Petra Kelly, the leader of the Green Party in Germany, said they must not join in government. And the Green Party in Germany eventually did after her untimely death. There is a certain aspect to which those that hold power are rarely willing to give up the real power. You know, they will agree to sustainable development goals, they will agree to reduce poverty, they will agree to reduce carbon emissions, but they won't agree to not take party funding from corporates who are dirtying the atmosphere. So there's an aspect of which genuine, real transition and paradigm change has to come from without the political system. But sometimes it comes incredibly quickly. Take, for example, Greta Thunberg, and the extent to which where are we now? November. 18 months ago, nobody knew her name on the planet. And all she did was sit outside the Riksdag in Stockholm, every Friday. And then when she came to Brussels, the European Parliament and the Commission felt obliged to have her come and speak to them. And this is the roots, this is the origins of the Green New Deal. Yeah, it wasn't the only factor. It wasn't the only factor, but it was one. And it's this type of outside activism that brings about the genuine change. Now, the question is, how can you incorporate this understanding of, as you said, people in the street empowering into the study of, let's say, the EU? It's a risk. There is a genuine risk that the EU, in trying to, let's say, invite Greta Thunberg or Black Lives Matter, or Me Too, into the political system somehow corrode or corrupt it, and that's always a risk. But it's also the case that I think that the better your political system is in listening, in answering and responding, the better chance we stand in addressing the really big questions. So the interesting question is those political systems that aren't able to change, that have no space for change. And I'm not saying this is a question of democracy versus non-democracy. For example, China astonishingly, introduced the one-child population policy and changed the direction of Chinese population forever. Chinese population is in decline and will be about a half of what it is today by the year 2070. China introduced a zero carbon policy by 2050. Well, it could introduce, if it wished, a zero carbon policy by 2025. So it's a question of responsiveness and the way in which change takes place. That doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I think there's always a necessity to tell the truth from outside and to take action from outside. The question is how quickly and how available are political systems to answering that action.
Okay, Armando. Okay, Armando, it's your turn.
Armando.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor. Really inspiring lecture. And I'd like to ask you a question. I come from a place in the south of Italy where criminality is a huge aspect of our life. And I think that this kind of aspect affects the way people think and approach to other aspects of life. And I think that in international fora, this kind of problem, organized crime, has really rarely been addressed by international organizations. And we know for its effect that this kind of criminal organization, they spread through, for example, neighbors to the whole country and all over the world. So my question is why it is really rarely addressed, this kind of problem, which is a huge problem to me, I think, in international fora. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Armando. A great question. I'm going to answer this question in two ways. One is to do it the conventional way, to say, there's an absolute necessity to think of criminality within the broader context of economy and society. One of the things that has occurred since the 1980s and what we describe as neoliberalism has spread across much of Europe and much of the world is that one of the consequences of neoliberalism is a fairly, let's say, laissez-faire, that means hands-off approach to the economy and to society as a whole. Benefits from that type of attitude, that type of approach. The EU doesn't have a mandate for addressing criminality within its member states. That is a national, local, or regional approach. But it can do much and should do much to prevent, as you say, the spread of criminality from one part of a country or the world to another. But in some respects, it doesn't. I won't go into some of the specifics that you're suggesting, but let me go back again to criminal financing. If there was no way of laundering the profits of criminal activity internationally, there would be much less a chance for criminalities to take place. But there is a way to launder money. In the country here in Denmark and in Sweden and in the Baltic states, but in Germany as well, we've seen banks engage in fraudulent activity, laundering Russian money for the last 10 years. In the aftermath of September the 11th, a list of the most common places in the world where terrorist money laundering and exchange took place was drawn up and identified as foci for systematic international cooperation to prevent money laundering from taking place. And it did not. The reason is that politicians also benefit from, not all, but some benefit from keeping these types of activities open. the UK leaving the EU will really help the EU because many of these locations, these offshore money laundering activities, and if you see the Netflix movie documentary, The Laundromat, you can start to understand that places part of the wider British Empire in the Caribbean have been essential in money laundering, both semi-legal and legal. And it was that money that fueled the campaign to leave the EU. So a starting point is understanding that neoliberalism and extreme forms of neoliberalism and hands-off approach to government and regulation go hand in hand with laundering the benefits of criminality. But I'm going to answer your question in a second way, just briefly. And this comes back to my point, and it's similar to the answer to Elora's previous question, is to imagine how to address criminality. It's not simply a question of rule of law and law and order. It is also a question of imagining society differently. And that has to come from the grassroots up. When I was about your age, I was growing up in Britain, and the most common problem was a form of criminality. It was actually terrorism. Armed, violent criminal groups in Northern Ireland spent much of the 70s and the early 80s killing each other, engaging in criminal acts, trading in drugs, in weapons, in bombs, blowing people up in Britain, shooting people in Northern Ireland. This was a society that had almost collapsed into criminality, where organised military groups of the North and South turned Northern Ireland into a criminal province. Now, yes, there was an agreement to stop the conflict, but the most important change was a shift in mindset that people were fed up of criminality in Northern Ireland and understood that criminality went with the Northern Irish conflict in the 70s and the 80s. So part of it is about the legal system. It's about the ideology of economy and society. But another part is about people taking action on the ground to work from the ground up, which is what I would argue is a normative power approach. I hope that at least partially answers some of your questions, Amanda. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so we have 2 or 3 minutes, and there is a question from the colleague Mariana Luna Ponte from Buenos Aires, attending from Buenos Aires. How can the will for change of certain actors be conciliated with the status quo resistance that this conception of planetary politics can generate? Is it possible to advance regionally and produce global effect commitments? What is the necessary condition for the realization of this perspective and practices?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you from Buenos Aires as well. I think it's extremely important this is a global conversation rather than simply a European or EU conversation. And that's the starting point of my answer is, I don't know if you're angry, but I'm really angry. You know, I am so angry that me and my family and your parents and my parents have to sit isolated because we stripped away the capacity of our societies and health systems to deal with what everybody said was coming, right? So the starting point for all of this is get angry and start telling the truth loudly. Start having that conversation. Start studying. Start empowering yourself and start talking to other students, family members, older people, younger people about what is going on in planetary politics. That is the starting point. It is the ignition for a fire that is already burning. In 2012, 2013, I went on sabbatical to Australia. First time I ever been there to talk to some political theorists and some environmental theorists, Robin Eckersley, most importantly. I was astonished with what I found in Australia. A beautiful, beautiful, beautiful continent, absolutely on the edge of extinction. You know, look at my map of places in the world that will be unlivable in your lifetimes. I'd never heard this before. And I study international environmental politics. So it's time for us to get informed and to talk about it and to talk about it very loudly. But how do we take action? Certainly you mentioned the regionality of it. There has to be a local response, almost certainly, but a translocal response as well. Why isn't there a collective of academics and students who are concerned about planetary political issues interacting more frequently? You know, one of the effects of the coronavirus has been to strip away our agency. But I think it's time to seize back that agency, because the availability of things like WebEx and Zoom and international communication has actually become a lot more common over the last 12 months. And I think that's a good thing. But I also think that we should use that to put direct pressure on political leaders at the local and, most importantly, at the regional level. The EU is not alone, but it seems to be alone in having concerns about the fact that every summer its forests burn, and every winter its rivers flood. And if you're Danish or British or Dutch, you know that's for sure, because it's coming and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And this is just the starting point of these challenges. All the issues that we've talked about today accelerate unless we take direct action. And whether that direct action is about teaching or whether it's about taking to the streets, I think we should do both. But certainly interacting with each other in this conversation is part of that. And reaching out to people you don't normally talk about. I talked about deglobalizing, regionalizing, and localizing. Coronavirus is the start of that. It's the way out of the problem, but it's the way in which it helps us see what a different world can look like. Sorry if I haven't answered your question more fully, Mariana. Thank you for the question.
Okay, the last one from Adriana, briefly if you can, because we are running out of time. Are you still there, Adriana? No. Okay, so our time is over, Jan. So I rarely seen so many enthusiastic comments on the chat. so really, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture, for your time, and so on. Question? No. Time is over, Michael. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan, and of course, thank you very much, students, for joining. And I hope to see you soon somewhere. If you don't fly, you know, maybe in Denmark, I don't know, or maybe on WebEx or other platforms. Okay.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. Thank you everyone for the other comments and for listening. And please start thinking and start taking action.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.